Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 34 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about safety. I titled this episode Slowing Down for Safety. And this is a little bit about our process with this topic and a little bit about the topic we will actually discuss as well. If you listen to the last couple episodes, we started out a couple weeks ago in episode 32 just introducing the concept of safety and its importance in trauma-informed care. And last week, I thought had just a great conversation with James and Susie Kowalski about their work with harm reduction and the trauma-informed care model. And so with all of that, I just really thought, and I know we thought that there's more to talk about, just to process the great discussion we had last week. And so we want to hit a few major points so we don't miss, I know, some of the key thinking that we all have around safety. So we're gonna practice what we preach, slow down a little bit, and see what other insights come out of our conversation. So as always, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. And Curt, I'll throw it to you first. What are you thinking about, reading about this week?
I'm doing a couple of projects with some schools. We've done some episodes about trauma-sensitive schools, and so I'm really excited to be involved with a couple of schools. And a couple of weeks ago now, we had a pretty fun day with classroom staff and clinical staff all together. It was really enjoyable to put the group together and let them kind of brainstorm around how to build relational activities or relational events into the daily schedule on a kind of even a moment by moment basis, and also combining that with a regulatory intervention. So it was really nice to watch. I kind of took a minute to just shut up and stop talking in the group, and just let them do their thing and let them kind of develop the ideas amongst themselves and let them develop the way it made sense for them to develop their classroom schedule. It was fun to watch the creativity happen among a group of young professionals, and they have tons of energy, which kind of feeds me too. So that was really enjoyable to watch. And I'm kind of excited to see the follow-up here now in a couple of more weeks to see where we've gotten and what kind of new ideas they'll come up with that I get to share some of that with others as well. So it's really enjoyable.
Very cool. And I've gotten that too. I think the conference Jerry and I went to, the Trauma Sensitive School Conference, there was a lot, when I went to the teachers' workshops, a lot of really cool strategies about just making sure you connect by name, make eye contact, as kids are walking into the room. And then again, those little moments for relationship building throughout are so critical. And sometimes we get so caught up that we jump right to what we got to get done. And I think that's a great lesson for all of us too. So Jerry, what about you, my friend? What are you thinking about this week?
Well, one is I woke up thinking about it snowing on May 3rd. So, I'm looking out my window, and it's actually very pretty on my deck out here. But really, what I've been trying to kind of think about is the stage of change as we are going into schools, as we are going into programs, of how to help people in some ways not just listen to this material, but really integrate this material and then be able to kind of effectively use that. And I think that what I went to a school training the other day, and it became really apparent that the people in the teachers, the administrators, the support staff in the school, um, we're really struggling with trying to integrate a trauma-sensitive understanding with their already formulated conception of what schools are about. And this stage of struggling with just an awareness of how my own mental models either allow me to be open or in some ways create barriers to me. I really want to kind of honor these schools that are sitting and struggling with this issue, rather than hearing a presentation and then saying, oh, you know what, that doesn't fit. That a lot of the schools that I've been in have really committed to trying to both deliver really high levels of academic expectations with being sensitive and supportive and encouraging. And sometimes that, we've kind of swung from one end to the other, but I really do want to kind of recognize some of the schools. I think what you're talking about, just to have a group of people sit around and talk about this, it really is about how to kind of find that middle ground, because traditionally we've gone, I'm either supportive or I'm giving rigor. How do we find that place at the beginning? So I've been really impressed with the commitment of schools, of treatment centers, of child welfare, a variety, really struggling with a lot of the issues we're kind of addressing on our podcast. So kudos to all of them.
Absolutely. And I had a similar experience yesterday. I presented at the Colorado Collaborative Justice Conference. And again, another, maybe even more so in some ways with the justice system, with the challenges of really integrating this material, but boy, just so much energy around it as well. And so it's really cool to see this take root in so many areas, and to be a part of that. It's just a really fun and humbling experience as well. So my nerdy piece, bright shiny object of the week, kind of twofold here. One is I found a podcast called the Brain Science Podcast. I think if you search just for brain science, that's how you get it on the apps. And it's really good. I like basically the woman who does it has authors on from some of the books I've read, some of the books I haven't read, but she does a really good job. You basically in an hour and a half get the cliff notes of these books from the actual authors. And so it's really well done, and the host is a great interview. And one of the episodes, I love it when sacred cows go to slaughter, because there was one episode with, and I'll butcher this name, our audience, if you've heard me in the past, Kowalski was my biggest achievement of the last 3 weeks pronouncing that right. I'll try Dr. Susanna Herculeo Hazel. I don't know. It's Brazilian too, so even if I got the nouns right and the vowels, I'm sure I screwed it up. But she's written a book called The Human Advantage. And so I've heard her interviewed before on other podcasts, but there were two sacred cows that I know I've used in my language in the past, where I've heard other authors that I really respect and speakers use them. I actually heard a speaker yesterday at the conference use it as well. And the first sacred cow was this idea that we have a reptilian brain as part of kind of the makeup of our brain, usually associated with the brain stem or the lower brain. And she points out two interesting facts about this. The first is that lizards have cortexes as well. So we kind of like downgrade lizards by just thinking that they're just a brain stem. But the real interesting thing, because this model's been around, I think for a long time now, 50, 60 years, and a lot of the real great authors that I just Googled in my notes, Daniel Siegel, a lot of several of my top 5, 6 authors that I like have use this terminology, and she points out something that I realized in my own work. I didn't really check the math on this terminology, is that we didn't evolve from reptiles. that reptiles were never in our evolutionary development. So when I've told people in the past that, early on in evolution, when we weren't human beings yet, but we were reptiles, we kept that part of the brain and then developed these mammal parts on top of it and so on and so forth, is if you Google human evolution, we never evolved from reptiles to begin with. So it's impossible to kind of have that in our brains evolutionarily. So I thought that was like a huge, okay, I'll stop using the lizard brain, so to speak, because while it represents a certain type of behavior, which may still be valuable, we don't have those reptiles in our family tree. The other one that I did really have to go back and change some slides that I've used historically is another sacred cow, is that we have 100 billion neurons in our brain. And this is a beautiful round number. And this is another one that's like authors, and I think it's in my book as well, I didn't go back and check that, have just kind of used this because it's been out there. And she actually tried to confirm this by using this amazing thing where she turned brains into food. And there's the reptilian brain. But she turned brains into soup, and what she found is that we actually have 86 billion neurons. So again, just something that's one of those things that we usually take for granted. Not 100 billion, but 86 billion. So just interesting as we go up, sometimes an author or somebody will come up with this terminology or this number, and we just assume that it's gospel, and eventually learn otherwise. So just some cool, I love it when I have to go change my slides. So
so Matt, two things about that.
Yeah.
One is, the correct term is we share a part of our brain with reptiles, which we don't share our prefrontal cortex with reptiles.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's a way to talk about it without being somewhat incorrect. And then the other one is, I don't think anybody has actually ever really went in and counted every synapse and connected, right? And so what they do is they take a slice. So you're probably somewhere between 86 billion and 100 billion, based on whoever's taking those slices. So, whatever it is, that's a lot of neurons.
It's a lot of neurons. But this is what
that's a lot of neurons.
What she did, which was really cool, was the traditional way where we got the 100 billion was using slices. She created this soup, which is fascinating. She did this with a lot of different animals as well, where you could actually, and the science is beyond me, but she goes through it in her book. And so it's interesting. She took a whole different approach and really changed that paradigm. But you're right, Jerry, we have a freaking lot of neurons in our brain.
That's all you got to say is, we got a lot of these neurons.
But it seems like we have more like 86 billion than 100 billion. So I don't know. For a nerd like me, 14 billion, I get excited about that. So
I think it's more important
that you killed that many drinking, Matt.
Yes.
Now you've become more reptile forward in your slides. I think that's really, really great.
Exactly. So there we go. So let's jump into the topic. Again, a good podcast, Brain Science. Again, if you're kind of interested in the brain but don't want to read hundreds of pages of these books, really good way to get an hour or so a month of really great learning. So a good one I'd recommend for the brain nerds out there like us. So I want to get into the safety piece of things. And Jerry, I know we were sort of chatting before the podcast, and you had a really good insight of just giving us a chance to kind of reflect back on the conversation with James and Susie, our conversation about psychological, emotional, physical safety. I feel like we've really covered a lot of ground the last couple weeks, and just some reflections. And Jerry, I know you had a good one that we were talking about before we went on air. So just kind of want that reflection, I think, is a great place to start our conversation today.
As we've been talking about safety and defining safety and really exploring the topic of harm or doing no harm, I've had the opportunity to sit in on several conversations where people in a position of power, of authority, we're dealing with individuals who had in some ways violated some rules in a school, in a treatment center. And what it became pretty evident quickly is that the violation of the rule created in some ways a dilemma for the people in power. And their response really was very quickly, how do we hold this person accountable? What is the consequence this person should receive? And it quickly moved. What I began to realize is they quickly moved from being in some ways a person who felt victimized by this rule violation to the perpetrator of we've got to hold this person accountable. We're doing something to the individual. And it made me think really in terms of the people that we work with have really been hurt and harmed. They've been harmed sometimes physically, sexually. They've been harmed by, in some ways, not having access to adequate health care. They've been harmed by not having adequate housing, adequate food, really have been injured. And they have a tendency periodically to act in ways to injure others. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult for us to kind of contain our own impulse, not to engage in using our power to kind of respond to them, instead of engaging in that question that we all kind of asked a lot of times is, so what happened to you to make you act this way? Mm-hmm. And then how do we figure out? So I think this issue of safety and harm, we looked at it from really the client's perspective, but I really think that therapists and teachers and community men feel harmed quite often. And in some ways, we rationalize and use our kind of position of power to inflict harm as a way of kind of controlling or holding people accountable, mm-hmm. as opposed to engaging in some kind of reparative practice that we know is more effective in teaching skills and also including people into our community. So I as we become more aware of this issue of safety and harm, if you just stop, you see these kind of interactions repetitively in the healthcare and in the therapeutic community.
Mm-hmm. And Curt, I want to. This is really fresh on my mind again after spending the day with criminal justice folks the other day too, because that there's just a whole system there where, and some of this obviously, if somebody's creating danger for others in the community, we may need to take that person out of the community for a while. But again, I'm kind of wondering, being in that kind of punishment sort of mentality. Not that the individuals had it, but just the system mentality. I wonder if somebody thinks about how to create environments and interactions that help promote healthy behaviors. Kind of your thinking on this issue.
Yeah, I think the issue it becomes one of those that is, in my thinking, has led to a lot of pre-planning and thinking always on the preventative side of things and the environmental design side of things. Because ultimately, if you don't go that direction with thinking about how to create environments where healthy behavior can happen, you're limited to reactionary styles. And then that's all you got. So that you just go down that road, right? Like the lack of planning for it and the lack of really understanding how those environments need to be designed, and the ideas of positive repetitive experience, I think, is one of those central ones. Then you're left with retaliatory procedures as your only option.
Yeah.
And a lot of the kind of the regulations and the rules and even not even codified regulations and rules, but within each culture, we basically create rules about what kinds of retaliatory events we're okay with.
Mm-hmm.
And those shift, those shift very, very frequently, and can shift from, one day to the next, even with our state. The more stressed out we get, the more likely we are to tolerate and want retaliation as an intervention.
Yeah. And the other thing that I've realized too, as working with the self-care perspective, is when we get stressed out and we feel harmed or unsafe too, we often result to that very rigid sort of response where we get very rule based and even like punitive at times. You look at zero tolerance, 3 strikes you're out, all these things that sometimes we're putting those on first graders, sometimes we're putting those on adults in the justice system, and there are all these really extreme responses. And so, I think it's just a real message that we need to be careful in our own responses around this piece as well.
And the issue, the real kind of slippery slope with it, talk about intervention as unilaterally good or unilaterally bad. It is, how do you look at the situation? And maybe for some kids, a 3-strike policy is a good thing to do. But you can design it in a way that is right for that individual and maybe right for a group, right? One of the things we used to think about with running correctional programs is the idea of, with certain diagnoses even, trying too hard essentially doesn't do that individual any good, right? So if things are not going well and we don't recognize it and we don't change, and sometimes that meant in a correctional population, when we were trying to help people to get out of the correctional institution into a community-based setting as a transition to getting back into the community at large. If we didn't recognize that things were not going well and say, listen, I'm really sorry, but you got to go back. You got to go back to being locked up, and we'll see you again, when you're ready to come back again. We created an environment that was incredibly unsafe by not setting the limit.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a real slippery slope in there of going, well, we should do this or we shouldn't do that as unilateral kind of decisions. And, one of the things I think Jerry is just so great at this, of always listening to what a person says or what a group says and recognizing these kind of pendulum swings from one side of a continuum to the other side, and being able to say, how do we get closer to the middle where we're looking at both sides of an issue? And I think that's really important when we are talking about safety, because on its face, right, creating safety is such a central theme to the idea of recovery from trauma. Given the violations of safety that actually are definitive to trauma, that reestablishing it is so central. And we talk about it often as just a kind of a conceptual thing, but it's really hard to pull off because it's different for every single person. Yeah. And that becomes an issue where having good teams who can help to regulate each other and regulate themselves and be able to sit with dilemmas and risks and rewards. And those are really important issues that are complex and hard to pull off.
Yeah.
Especially as stressed out as we all get. So yeah, some thoughts about safety is it's an incredibly complex topic that we all kind of go, oh yeah, safety is important. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Safety is important. But doing it is really quite complicated.
Yeah. Well, and kind of thinking too, I think your point, obviously your point's really strong. The other thing on the flips, not necessarily the flip side of that, but if we continue that thinking too, is when we do, my experience, I was sharing this a lot yesterday in juvenile justice, is, we had these kids coming in that were involved in this gang war going on in Indianapolis at the time. And obviously they were creating safety concerns for their community by selling drugs and engaging in violent acts. But we would then what do we do with it? Because they're not safe in the community, they're not safe for the community, but then we bring them out of the community and place them in a cottage where we mix the vice lords in with the gangster disciples and think that that's a safe, that's going to help them change. And yet what really strikes me is, in many ways, whether it's a prison system, whether it's sometimes, again, my experience in juvenile justice, which I know this isn't what happens everywhere. But sometimes when we take them out of unsafe situations, we got to pay attention to, are we giving them a chance to be in a safe situation where they can heal and develop a new neurobiology to go back and act the different way. So that was a real cool thinking that was going on at the conference yesterday as well. And Jerry, just love to get your thoughts on this too.
So, two things that come up. One is how we are constantly trying to make meaning of the world so that we kind of create polarities, right? So what do we know about the research? Being an authoritarian parent doesn't create healthy kids, right? Where there's external rules that are challenging and kind of doing it, right? On the other hand, being a permissive parent doesn't create healthy kids, right? So when we get pushed to extremes of these issues, what we really want to be able to do is, how do we have really clear expectations, social expectations of what it means to be in our clan? What do we expect from each other, and how do we behave with each other, and have limits around that, and also be supportive, encouraging, and in some ways connected. And I think that starts from really in the first few months of life of an infant trying to kind of be in relationship with the caregiver being misattuned, and then repairing it. And if we get pushed in either direction, we end up being disconnected from each other. And that's not our natural biological state. We're social creatures. We need to be in relation with others. And whenever we push someone outside of those connections, whether it be because we're being neglectful and not being clear and setting expectations, or we're being too punitive and not staying connected, we increase the risks of the very thing that we're saying may harm us. Right. So I think that this is a really important, whether you're dealing with parenting, whether you're dealing with therapeutic relationships, or whether we're dealing with community kind of responses to rule violations and law violations. How do we set clear expectations and limits, but stay relationally connected? That's the challenge. And we're always going to be pushed to polarities. And when you look at usually these discussions, one side is too soft and the other side is too hard. And we kind of keep getting pushed in different directions. But really, it's how do you integrate these kinds of, it's a dilemma. Mm-hmm. How do you integrate these kinds of, and the bigger the violation, the more stress it is to get pushed in one direction or the other for us to kind of, which is why kind of having a team to kind of stop and kind of do it, having those things pre-planned, mm-hmm. Of rituals for us to go through to help us not get our stress push us to some type of polarized position.
Great.
I think as you're talking, Jerry, it made me think of years and years of being in team meetings. One of the patterns I've noticed the most is when we start talking about these violations or rule violations or safety risks that happen, right? Usually that is something that somebody did, right? Some behavior that somebody engaged in that we're like, they can't do that, or they shouldn't do that. Where I see teams getting pushed in these polar positions is even in how we describe the behavior. Right? That we even say that what we do I think this is kind of linguistically in our culture, right? Is we say they threw a pencil, and then the next thing we say is because. Mm-hmm. And then that next because is our hypothesis for why that happened. And what we get is a bunch of different hypotheses about why that person did it, right? They did it to get attention. They did it to get out of work. They did it to try and hurt somebody. They did it because they're traumatized. They did it we get all of these different becauses. And one of the things I've seen that teams really can do best with is to try and consider as many of those becauses as they can, instead of trying to go with one or the other. And that pushes people into polarities really, really quickly. So team leaders, the ones that were really good could say, they could hear multiple ones of those and keep asking their group or their team, what else do we think about that? What other reasons can we think of that might happen? What do we understand about development that would impact that because? Or what do we understand about attachment that would impact that because? Mm-hmm. So these lenses are, what do we think about safety that would impact that because? Those are really critical, I think, conversations for teams to be able to have that really get us to this point of establishing environments where we can be safe and we can establish safety. And it helps us, the more I think we can have those discussions and consider multiple becauses, it helps us to regulate teams. Mm-hmm. That we can start to do a little bit more perspective taking in teams and being able to have those discussions about considering alternative points of view about why that might have happened or what might have been going on inside the skin of that person that resulted in this action or this problem that happened outside. Those are great conversations to have to get a team and a collection of people together to really formulate some creative ideas and creative interventions and creative supports for people.
Well, and one of the things that I really like that I'm sort of seeing in educational thinking around behavioral issues too, to build on what you're saying, Curt, with some of the curiosity behind it is, even if it's a first grader or a preschooler, even asking the person that does the behavior what their theory is behind the behavior as well. And really bringing that in and having, I like this because they're using some of these reflective listening skills that we always take for granted as therapists or social workers, but really encouraging educators to, just sit with the child and dig and be curious and let the child explore. And I think we can do this easily with adults as well, is what do you think's behind the behavior? And what these seem to be evolving into is, let's take that behavior in the context it is. Maybe this kid throws a pencil in first period in art class and, throws a rock in gym class. But let's take the first period class, not focusing on an overall behavior, but looking at that specific and helping that child tell us sort of what's behind that behavior as well. And I think if we bring that curiosity in and bring sort of the child or even as the adult into that process, we may get a lot more useful information as well if we're patient enough to sit and help them think and reflect on their behavior too.
So you mentioned some really important things, Matt, and really, so Curt, you're really talking about engaging in a reflective function. Right? Is not confusing what I think with what reality is. And that we stop and we go into a reflective process to kind of look at that, right? So I'm able to not take what's going on in my body. I'm able to take what's going on in this interaction, and we're able to step back and do some reflection on it before we actually respond. Right? And you set up a process for your team to do that. And you're really talking about, so it's very important to understand that trauma interferes with that process. Mm-hmm. Right? And so when we're dealing with dealing with people who have been harmed or their behavior harms us, it's going to be very hard for us to stay in that place where we could stop and engage in a reflective process. we're much more likely to engage in pattern repetitive automatic responses, right? And so Curt's thought about it is, if we're going to respond in a pattern automatic response, why not build a reflective process as our automatic response? That's our ritual, right? So we're going to forget to do exactly what you're saying, Curt, in a team if we don't have it built in as a process when we get stressed. We're going to forget to do that in a therapeutic relationship if we don't have it built in as a process. So we know that going into certain relationships, going into certain environments, emotions are contagious. We're going to be pulled into, in some ways, that's what this concept of trauma organized is about. We have to build in certain habits that allow us not to respond in a kind of reactive way, but engage in exactly what the both of you are talking about: is stop, pause, and have a reflective process and make a decision about what are we trying to achieve and how to respond to it. So I think really that's what I think really gets lost when we have these automatic kind of consequences for things as opposed to an automatic reflective process for things.
Yeah. You reminded me of, I used to give myself, when I first became a group clinical leader, I would do these group supervisions and I would get really anxious in them, right? As the new leader, right? I've always felt like I had to have the answer. And so I would get super anxious about them. And I had to give myself a little kind of ritual cheat sheet. And I would take it with me to every single one of my supervisions. And right at the very top, I had myself a little like kind of 3-word mantra or 3-idea mantra, which was pause, check in with your internal state, and then ask a question. And I would be looking at that like it'd be on my table in front of me, right? And then I wrote down my 10 favorite questions. So I had them all written down right on my piece of paper right in front of me. It took me maybe 3 or 4 months probably doing that a couple of times a week. And I didn't need it anymore. But establishing it so that I had built in a ritual. And now that's just my habit, right? I mean, that's just what you do. Now it's more like you ask enough questions until you feel like you have enough information, and then you start giving some answers or start giving a little bit of maybe we think about doing this or some recommendations. But that really helped me at developing that kind of a process, because I couldn't depend on my own regulated state in this environment in which I was anxious to do that. Otherwise, I would go with, I'd feel like, I got to have an answer. So I would just say something and wasn't really always that thoughtful, but that I had to learn how to do that and kind of structure it for myself to do that.
Right. So really you weren't feeling safe.
Yeah.
And so this concept of safety is so important in not only thinking about our clients, but the staff and the organization, of how much anxiety we hold and what are our practices and rituals to ensure that we can in some ways manage it in a healthy way, and not in some ways externalize it and start to control other people or blame other people or start to be feeling competent blaming ourselves. Yeah. How do we build rituals? And I think some of them things we've talked about here is kind of mindfulness practices. We've talked about, right? Some of the things we've talked about along the way, creating some more knowledge so we have different mental models and frameworks to kind of, it doesn't mean our frameworks are reality. It just helps us organize so that we have so really today, really the accumulation of all the things we've talked about go into creating increased internal and external resources to help us in some ways be more responsive rather than reactive.
Yeah. And one of the things that I find really so useful, and it's a very simple concept, which I love simple concepts, because again, this can all get really complex pretty quickly, is, most of my trainings when I talk about, pretty simple trauma-informed approaches, it's the ability, whether we're talking about our own process or whether we're talking about our interactions with folks, to slow down when possible. You know, when I do a lot of training with medical professionals, and, you know, I just have such an empathy for physicians, nurse practitioners, physicians assistants, nurses, all these folks who, you know, sometimes as a therapist, I may build a relationship for hours with a person before I even discuss trauma. And with only sometimes maybe 15 minutes, most of that being medical stuff and not relationship building, 15 minutes, a half hour of contact, you know, physicians are doing some pretty intense examinations, especially for victims of sexual abuse and other things. And I think, you know, no matter what environment we're in, a lot of times some of the behaviors come out when we jump, whether it's ahead of the stages of change, or we're just so kind of hyper aroused to get our agenda down that we miss somebody else's sort of cup, or anxiety is starting to fill up or build over time. So, you know, a lot of this can get really complex, and we can talk about, you know, 86 billion neurons versus 100 billion neurons. And in some ways, slowing down might be the most trauma-informed thing we can do, whether it's like, Curt, you're saying at team meetings, or as we're talking about, Jerry, with the interactions themselves. And I think we don't miss as much when we do that. We're more connected with the individual. And if we can find ways to slow down, we may not see some of those behaviors pop up in the same way too.
When I was, I think about this kind of concept a lot, right? When I was a high school football player, my football coach used to always talk to me about mental toughness. And then when he was talking about mental toughness, what he was talking about was continuing to push when you felt like you wanted to stop. That was always the thing, right? If you want to push your fitness, if you want to push your physical capacity, if you want to get better at a competitive sport, that was one of the things that you really needed to master, was the ability to keep yourself, your effort high, even when you felt like stopping. In the organizational world, mental toughness is almost the exact opposite. That mental toughness is actually being able to pause and ask questions like, how much time do I have to make this decision? What are the resources that I have to be able to solve this problem? And resist almost the urge to act too quickly. Because in organizations, we have lots and lots of things that feel like threats to us that really aren't. Things that feel like, you know, somebody stepped on my toes, or I have to make this decision quickly, I'm going to look bad. There are lots and lots of things like that, and often the faster we act, the more impulsively we act, it can lead to very different decisions than if we gathered more information. Mm-hmm. That requires us managing this stress response that we have, that is designed to organize us, our bodies, and our resources to deal with immediate threats. And we've got to manage that a lot, especially in social groups and especially in organizational contexts. And it becomes even more important to do that when the work that we do is to really invite people who have undergone experiences that have elevated their stress response, where they feel threatened all the time.
Yeah.
That becomes a part of the organization where there's this constant level of pain and of emotional frustration and anger, and a lot of these kind of high energy, unpleasant affective states that get generated, and the parallel process concept, which in behavioral parlance we call that interlocking contingencies. We start to affect each other, and that travels up the organizational hierarchy, and then as it gets up high enough, right, your urge to retaliate sends it right back down the organizational hierarchy, and we go round and round in these retaliatory cycles. So this idea of mental toughness was a good one for me, and I love sports analogies, so that's one that I've thought of a lot, about how do I use that idea of mental toughness that I learned as a young man playing high school football, and apply it to myself in a professional context, and use my inhibitory power, essentially, of my frontal cortex to really help me to do what needs to be done in the moment. And sometimes that's waiting more than acting.
Very good analogy.
Absolutely. I want to just with the few minutes we have left, really talk about the concept, and this can be called different things in different environments. It can be it can be its own multi-page document, or it just can be a question or two, and that's the concept of safety planning. And this is a concept that I really thought a lot about in the process of writing the book and trying to put all these harm reduction into motivational interviewing and all these paradigms together. And really why I sort of it came to that level of importance is at some point, whether if it's a younger child, we may be asking the question, Curt, like you said, and just having this discussion with somebody else. As people get older, we may have these conversations with them, but really finding space to have a conversation, slow down enough with the individual, again, with maybe the team, and say, how can we help this person reduce harm in their life and increase safety? And I think that why that became so important to me is it gives us a chance to sort of sit back and reflect on that as part of our structured way. Jerry, I think this was you that said this, is sort of we structure a pause into our reaction. So it becomes a natural part. And I think too often, with everything else we're doing, sometimes safety and reduction of harm, which I think over the last 3 episodes we say has to be a priority for so many reasons, gets skipped over. And I would love to get, as we think about a tangible way for people to integrate thinking about safety, reducing harm into conversations, whether we call it safety planning or some other aspect. Kind of some tangible strategies that we may be able to give folks to put this thinking as part of their structure and their consideration.
One thing I think about the issue of safety planning is that intervention requires risk, right? And one way to think about a safety plan is if we're going to do some treatment intervention or we're going to take a direction, that we've got to manage what the risks are with taking that action. And so the safety plan is really something that allows us to kind of regulate our own anxiety or our own fear about taking a risk. And I think that's a fundamental concept of safety planning to be incorporated in there, that a safety plan often needs to come along with something that some intervention or some slight risk that we're going to take simultaneously. Otherwise you don't really need a safety plan, right? Like, so sometimes there is the risk of inaction, right? That we're going to take the action of, say, if it's a stabilization need versus a progress need, then we're taking this approach of saying we need to do stabilization, so we're not going to take this other risk. We're going to take the risk of waiting. And our safety plan is how do we mitigate that risk so that we can get to another point. So that's something I think is an important way of thinking about safety planning that has been certainly useful to me over the years of writing lots of safety plans or thinking about safety plans, is what is the risk that we're going to take that can get us to a different position rather than just maintaining us where we are right now and maintaining safety in this moment. That's always got to be towards a positive view of the future of somewhere we're going to go.
Yeah, just to add a thought to that too, because I think that's a great point, is also I think, especially working in the areas of homelessness, is as long as somebody is in, pretty consistent, dangerous and potentially harmful living situations, living out on the street, maybe sharing needles, those sort of things, we have to sort of manage our expectations that they'd be able to take a healthy risk, which for some folks might be engaging in mental health services, because that seems like a risky thing for them to do, more so than it seemed for me really risky to go sleep under the bridge. For some people, that's where they've been living for a long time, and that sort of become their normal, and weirdly feels somewhat secure in a way that it would never hopefully never feels for me. So, there's this interesting dynamic of, if we create safety, then is there more ability and capacity for healthy risk taking, whether that's simple things like going and looking at a housing program, maybe going to a parenting class, other sort of things like that, that from our perspective might not seem like a risk, but for them might feel a lot more scary than things that we might think would be scary from our perspective too.
Well, to think about it, kind of even to take the ideas from the attachment language, is the idea of a secure base.
Yeah.
The more secure your base is, the more ability you're likely to have to go out from that secure base and have a place to come back if when you go out it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right? Or something happens that you need to get back to that secure base. So that's a kind of concept I like to pull out from certainly thinking about your bridge example, right? Like bridge can be a secure base, whereas going to sleep in a house, that might be the risk.
Yeah.
So thinking about those things, I think is really pretty exciting to think about.
Yeah.
We could shift the way that we think a little bit when we're helping people to make some healthy risks.
Absolutely. Jerry, any final thoughts on this for us?
I think the term safety planning kind of gets associated with somebody's suicidal, something to do, right?
Safety contracts, a lot of times.
They become contracts, which are a really important kind of look at it, although they don't necessarily are as effective as we would hope they were.
They might make us feel better though.
But I'm thinking in terms of trauma work, and that I'm constantly engaged with my client in safety planning, because really, for my clients that I've worked with, really in some ways revisiting their memories is a safety risk. And how do we talk about building resources? How do we talk about what are those resources in your life? How do we kind of help you plan to use those resources? How do I help you practice using those resources before we're actually going to go in there and visit that painful because I want this not to be a re-traumatization, but a healing and recovery process, right? And so the concept of safety planning for professionals working with trauma is a constant variable in your interactions with your clients, is that safety is always present. And there's really sometimes a confusion of responsibility, that I feel like I'm responsible as a therapist for the safety, as opposed to this is a collaborative process where we have to, in some ways, talk about safety, about what you need and what we need, and we find a way to do this collaboratively together to make this a kind of a healing experience for you. So whether you're talking about helping somebody take a risk to get out from under a bridge and go to do it, or if you're talking about having somebody go inside and remembering something really painful that happened to them, you have to build in that capacity to both utilize the relationship, but also to be the capacity to have at least one foot in the present while you're doing something in the past, or right, to kind of looking at that. So I'm constantly thinking in my head about safety planning. And so that it's not just this paper that we create and it's a contract, although that's one type of safety. But safety is constantly involved with these issues of coming to, one is, what does it even mean to come to somebody else to ask for something, right? What does it mean for somebody to give me something? What does it mean? You're talking to people who have found what they're doing is their solution to feeling safer, right? They're regulating their bodies. They found a way. So the very act of asking them to stop doing something creates a safety issue.
Yeah.
How do we begin to really plan for and have a plan to say is, how do we kind of recognize and honor what that has done for you, but also that we could begin to build in other alternatives to take that place. So safety is constantly in the minds of a trauma therapist. Whether you're doing what we believe is a good practice, we've talked about mindfulness is, for a trauma victim to get quiet and go inside and explore their internal world. Talk about visiting a scary neighborhood, right? How do we make that safe? What do we do to build this in practices? So, and hopefully we'll kind of talk about that some more. But so this concept, we should never, ever go away, even on our podcast, of getting away from the concept of safety. So we could come back here every episode and talk about, so what's safety and what we're talking about.
Absolutely. So, and one of the things that, just to piggyback on Jerry, because, working with a lot of HIV case managers, people that are doing treatment plans that are not quite as psychologically in depth sometimes as we do as therapy, just one of the suggestions I've started giving people is when you update those treatment plans, just have on there that you'll think about safety, that you may have a safety goal or safety objective on there. And if there's no issues, then there's no issues, but it's just a reminder that people's safety needs and reduction of harm evolve over time. And so just to keep that, I love to have structural ways that remind us of what critical driver of outcomes are. And so again, whether you're a therapist, you're probably creating your treatment plan based on some of that stuff. But even if you're in housing, healthcare, HIV, other arenas too, it can be a really good thing just to give us a trigger to remind us to keep that in the forethought of our mind.
I think, Matt, as you're talking about that, putting safety up there, putting the issue of how are issues of power being managed, because safety and power go very much together, and the issue of responsibility.
Yeah.
How much am I taking responsibility for something that I should be in some ways working with them, or how much are they taking responsibility? But those issues are always present. So having a little reminder.
Yeah.
How are we dealing with safety? How are we dealing with power? And how are we dealing with responsibility? Because people who have been traumatized have lost safety. They have issues of not having power. And so they struggle with issues of power in their lives. And they have a confusion of responsibility. They felt they were responsible for something they may not have responsible. And sometimes they don't take responsibilities for things that they should take responsibility for. So things are always, should be on your sheet each and every time you do a treatment plan to say, how is this manifesting in my client, and how am I managing these issues?
Absolutely. And again, if we can throw those things in structurally just to remind us, I find that incredibly useful because, everybody wants to throw a goal and objective on those sheets. So just prioritize ours. So great episode, guys. We have an exciting new thing we're going to try next week. We actually had a viewer request for an episode on trauma and the expression of gratitude. So I pushed our friend Deborah Cronwell to give us some questions. We met her at the Trauma Sensitive School Conference, and so we're going to have a request show. So remember, we used to do that on the radio, call in and make requests. So this throws it out there to folks. We may not get to it in a timely manner, but if you do have a question, go to traumainformedlens.org. We love your comments, so throw it up there. We'll put show notes, discussion questions. You can see the video here. I don't know if the dog made an appearance in the video today, but got the audio version. So always good to hear from the dogs. And yeah, we'll see you next week for our first listener request episode. So Curt, Jerry, thank you guys so much. And viewers know we'll probably mention safety from every episode here out, and you can probably find it in all the previous ones as well. So great discussion. Thanks, guys.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.